I hate this place game review. Good ideas, poor execution. Based on the comic book series of the same name, I Hate This Place is an isometric survival adventure with some genuinely interesting ideas and a handful of smart twists on the genre. Unfortunately, it's also weighed down by a rough execution. Janky controls, imprecise aiming, and several fiddly gameplay segments quickly sap the enjoyment, which is a real shame. Worse still, I encountered multiple progression-breaking bugs, including being soft-locked out of missions entirely and forced to hard restart when scripted events failed to trigger. It's a frustrating experience, and one that consistently undermines the game's better ideas. The story at the heart of I Hate This Place is fairly straightforward and centers on a young woman named Elena. Unlike the comic series, the game marches to the beat of its own drum, with an original story set within the same unsettling world. When Elena's friend, Lou, goes missing after a ritual gone horribly wrong, she sets out to bring her back. At the same time, she's grappling with unanswered questions surrounding her mother's disappearance years earlier. As the mystery deepens, Elena finds herself entangled with strange cults, disturbing rituals, and shadowy scientific experiments, all hinting at the looming arrival of a sinister entity known as the Horned Man. Much of the game unfolds in Rutherford Ranch, which serves as the central hub for this grim adventure. After a brief prologue designed to familiarize you with the controls and core mechanics, more on that shortly, the game eases you in with a handful of early missions that establish the basic gameplay loop and set expectations for what follows. The game blends survival horror with light resource crafting, and for the most part, it handles that balance well. Rutherford Ranch acts as your central base of operations, where you can build workbenches, water towers, and gardens, to name but a few, to keep your supplies topped up. These structures allow you to convert raw materials into practical essentials like food, bandages, and other survival items. As the game progresses, managing these resources becomes increasingly important, especially once you start traveling further afield. Late on, the core loop settles into a familiar rhythm. You return to the ranch, restock your supplies, then head back out into the unknown again. Adding another layer to this is a separate hunger meter, distinct from your HP. You will need to eat regularly to stay alert and energized, as letting this meter deplete will permanently reduce your stamina until you've had food. It won't outright kill you, and over-encumbrance is fairly forgiving compared to something like Fallout, but the penalties are noticeable enough to keep the pressure on. Elena can carry a surprisingly generous amount of gear, and the world is packed with resources to scavenge. Alongside standard materials like wood and scrap metal, you will also uncover blueprints, which unlock new weapons, gear, and key items to use out in the world. Beyond the main storyline, there's no shortage of side content either. Some of these side quests quietly feed back into the main narrative and are effectively mandatory, sending you into eerie mines, flooded bunkers, and other hostile locations. Others, however, are far less inspired, boiling down to basic fetch quests and tick box objectives that add little beyond padding. Difficulty is really the issue here, at least not outside of wrestling with the game's mechanics. That said, I Hate This Place does itself no favors when it comes to onboarding. The game never clearly explains that hovering over an objective in the menu will highlight it and mark the general area on your map. This becomes a recurring issue in several dungeons, which often require very specific actions without offering any guidance or visual cues. The only time you are truly likely to get stuck is through the game's failure to communicate its own rules. In one flooded bunker, for example, progress hinges on shooting a small button mounted on the wall to trigger a chain reaction. The game never tells you this, nor does it provide any meaningful hint that this is what you were meant to do, leaving progression to trial and error rather than problem solving. The missions themselves are serviceable and generally revolve around exploration and light combat. While the game does allow for a more aggressive run-and-gun approach, stealth is clearly the preferred method of traversal, fitting, given that many of the creatures feel heavily inspired by A Quiet Place. Environmental hazards play into this nicely. Broken glass and slimy red tentacles amplify your footsteps regardless of how slowly you crouch, forcing you to plan your movement carefully. That said, most enemies follow simple, predictable patrol routes, meaning it's often possible to avoid combat entirely if you were patient. Ironically, charging through areas can sometimes be just as effective too. Given your sprint speed easily outpaces most enemies, and once you move into a different room, they'll simply stop pursuing you. It's easy to ignore them completely. It's a slightly cheesy tactic, but outside of spiders, most enemy encounters are easy enough to bypass or clean up quickly.